Phillips. Now, Jes is the Policy and Practice Officer for the Race Equality Foundation and has travelled here from Kent to spend the day with us. Now, the foundation works to overcome discrimination and disadvantage in public services where this arises from ethnicity and includes dementia services. Jes is going to open up some of their work for us now with a talk with the title Better Support for Black, Asian and Minority Ethnic People Living with Dementia. And it's worth mentioning here that Brace is involved with the Chinese, Caribbean, South Asian and African Dementia Working Group in Bristol, which is working to ensure equal access to dementia support and information. And I know some of the members of that working group have been in the audience today. Anyway, without further ado, Jes, thank you very much indeed.
Well, I don't need to introduce myself now because you've done it for me. That's perfect. Firstly, actually, I just want to say how great it's been to hear everyone talk, share their stories and their experiences and their research. So I'll just do a brief introduction, although you did kind of do one, and then I'll look at some of the evidence on Black, Asian and minority ethnic older people and link that into the risk factors for dementia. Then we'll look at some of the inequalities experienced throughout the dementia care pathway, and we'll finish on some of the change that's taken place. So we're a Black, Asian and minority ethnic-led voluntary organisation, and we explore what is known about discrimination. We develop evidence-based better practice, disseminate better practice, and we work with national, local, community, voluntary and statutory sector partners, as well as working directly with communities. And although we are here to discuss dementia, I think it's important we don't lose sight of the fact that although some minority ethnic groups have a lower life expectancy than their white British counterparts, they have a higher life expectancy than in their countries of origin. So the progress of migration has meant that we have many more older minority ethnic peoples than elsewhere. So here's just an age breakdown by ethnicity, and it's using the 2001 and 2011 census data. And I'm not going to go into it massively, but it basically just says, it shows us that for some communities that we have an aging population. So people that moved over kind of mid-90s, 1950s, African Caribbean communities, Indian Pakistani communities will now be moving into their 70s and 80s. We know that people who move here more recently tend to be younger. It will be interesting with the 2021 census data to see how much the older group of minority ethnic people has grown. Here we're looking at income inequality by ethnicity, and on the left side is the percentage of individuals in the bottom two income quintiles, and then on the right side we have the percentage of individuals in the top two income quintiles. And as you can see, we have a really high percentage of Bangladesh, Pakistani and Black individuals in the bottom two income quintiles, and then that's reflected then with a low percentage of Bangladeshi, Pakistani and Black individuals in the top two income quintiles. We're looking at housing inequality here, and this again uses the 2011 census data. But what it shows us is that all minority ethnic groups experience greater housing deprivation than their white counterparts. But this is particularly true for Bangladeshi and Black African communities. And if you can see over on this side, it's 80 or over, so individuals aged 80 or over. We have a high percentage of Bangladeshi and Black African people living in housing deprivation. We also know that minority ethnic people are more likely to live in deprived neighbourhoods. Nearly half of all Black African adults, older adults, live in flats, and minority ethnic older adults tend to be concentrated in urban areas in London or other major cities. Some of these inequalities will have stemmed from historical circumstances, so for example, racial exclusion from local housing authorities or private landlords or neighbours, and more recently experiences of gentrification, displacement and stigmatisation. This graph shows us the percentage of people aged 50 to 69 who are inactive, eat unhealthily, smoke or drink alcohol. And over on the left side, it shows us that 59% of the white British population and 66% of Black, Asian and minority ethnic population engage in one or more of those activities. This is actually higher for the Asian community. 72% of Asian women and 70% of Asian men engage in one or more of those activities. Here we're looking at health conditions, and we know that there's a higher incidence, prevalence and mortality rate for cardiovascular disease in South Asians. They also have increased risk of coronary heart disease. African, Caribbean and South Asians are more likely to have high blood pressure, and we know that minority ethnic groups are less likely to access cardiac rehabilitation. African, Caribbean and South Asian communities are also more likely to have increased risk of type 2 diabetes and develop it at a younger age. There was a cohort study that estimated by the age of 80, 40 to 50% of African, Caribbean and South Asian men and women will have type 2 diabetes. And the national data tells us that Black people have the highest percentage of overweight and obese adults. Now, these are all really important points that I've shared with you because they all link into the risk factors for dementia. So not only is ethnicity itself a risk factor of dementia, but like I spoke about, deprivation, health behaviours, health conditions all increase a person's risk of dementia. There's also research to show that stressful and traumatic life events increase a person's risk of dementia. So things like racism, poverty-induced stress can increase minority ethnic communities' risk of dementia. So these are important when we think about implementing preventative measures kind of across the wider determinants of health. So it's estimated that 25,000 Black, Asian and minority ethnic individuals have dementia, and that's predicted to rise to about 50,000 by 2026, with the greatest increase in South Asian communities. Some recent research by Naheed Muqaddam shows us that Black and South Asian people are younger at the point of dementia diagnosis. They have less survival time, so from diagnosis to end of life, and they die at a younger age. Research also tells us that Black ethnic groups are more likely to get a dementia diagnosis post-stroke, and socioeconomic deprivation in England and Wales is associated with increased dementia mortality, younger age at death, and poorer access to specialist diagnosis. And this is important if we keep in mind some of the things I told you about inequalities and deprivation. So here we're going to have a look at some of the inequalities that Black, Asian and minority ethnic people experience throughout the dementia care pathway. This isn't necessarily all of them, but throughout our research, these are some of the ones that come up time and time again. And looking at awareness and understanding of the condition, I think some people have already said that there's actually still a low awareness, but in some minority ethnic groups, there's low awareness of the condition and also of the signs and symptoms and the causes. We know in some South Asian language there's no direct translation, so it's difficult to talk about. And for some communities, they attribute some of the symptoms as a natural part of ageing. Stigma, experiences of stigma and shame exist in some minority ethnic communities. We know that for the Chinese community, dementia is a relatively new concept and has picked up quite a negative perception. For the African Caribbean community, the social stigma of mental ill health is kind of compounded by the fear of discrimination and institutionalisation within health and care services. And some of these factors mean that people might not present to services at all, or when they do, it might be later on in the disease progression. We know that there's inequalities through during the diagnosis process. So the diagnostic tools themselves don't cater to people's language and cultural needs. So often that can lead to a misdiagnosis or no diagnosis at all. And simply translating the diagnostic tools isn't adequate. The cultural bias significantly impacts the validity, I can never say that word, of the test. And then we have inequalities for unpaid carers. So I think there's often an assumption around minority ethnic families having to look after their own and having large extended families who can all kind of take care and help with the caring roles. And that's often not the case and can lead to a reduced offer of support. It's also the case that minority ethnic carers face a more complex circumstance, so they're more likely to be struggling financially. They're more likely to care for longer hours, which means that they are increasing the risk of their own poor health and social exclusion. We know that minority ethnic carers like to seek support from voluntary-led organisations as a trusted source of support. Now thinking about the accessibility and acceptability of services, so we often hear that once people have a diagnosis of dementia, that the support following that is not adequate, so they feel like they don't have enough information and they're not really sure where to go to get the right support. We also know that there's a number of language barriers that mean that accessing the right services can be challenging, as well as a low understanding of the services themselves and how to navigate them. There's issues around institutional and covert racism, that's historically and current, which mean that can lead to a mistrust in services and some people not feeling like they're for them. And then lastly, thinking about palliative and end-of-life care services. Again, there's lower understanding of what these services are, so people don't feel confident to know what to ask for or what to expect. We know that some minority ethnic groups access these services less or later. There's an issue around cultural awareness. Sometimes that can mean that services feel like quite alienating spaces, and there's a concern for people that they may not consider their cultural, religious or spiritual needs. So again, those services don't necessarily feel like they're for them. So just thinking about some of these areas helps if we think about some of the targeted measures that can be taken. So for example, raising awareness among communities or adapting services where possible to be delivered among the community. There is some change taking place, and it's important to say that Black, Asian and minority ethnic-led voluntary organisations are at the centre of driving change. We know that collaborative working between health and care services, voluntary sector, local authorities is necessary to create whole system change. And I've linked to Leeds Dementia Partnership here. They've been working in this area for a long time. The partnership has a number of different people around the table, including lots of Black, Asian and minority ethnic-led voluntary organisations with the council, health professionals, and they've developed a strategy. They've been investing in services since 2013 to ensure that they have a better offer of support. And they also, there's been a Black, Asian and minority ethnic support worker commissioned from a charity. They've been able to implement memory cafes, but culturally appropriate ones that have been delivered in mother tongue. And that's for people living with dementia, their carers, their family and friends. It's also really important that we have culturally appropriate resources that can be for people living with dementia, for communities, for health and care professionals, and commissioners. So I've linked to ADAPT, which is a project that the Race Equality Foundation were involved in alongside the University of West England, the University of Bradford and some others. And within this project, the aim was to create a set of online resources specifically for the South Asian community across the dementia care pathways. So it had things on raising awareness, diagnostic assessment and diagnostic tools, psychosocial interventions which were developed specifically for the South Asian community, but also ones that have been adapted, and recommendations for commissioners and other health and care professionals involved in delivering services. I've also linked to Amber Care Solutions because they have an array of services that are personalised and culturally adapted to the communities they serve. And I also heard actually Emily speaking earlier from the Chinese Community Wellbeing Society about some services they offer. So they offer cultural awareness training for statutory services, which is really amazing. They're based in Bristol. And what's also really important, alongside raising awareness of the condition, is to raise awareness of some of the preventative measures that can be taken. So I've linked to Sheffield Environmental Movement, which is an organisation. They work with Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, refugee communities to widen participation in the natural environment. So they run things like Black Men's Walking Group, Walk for Health, horse riding, lots of different activities, and they create a safe space for minority ethnic people to engage in physical activity. Now, this is obviously a preventative measure for dementia, but it's also a preventative measure for a number of the health conditions that I mentioned at the beginning. So my final slide, and I just wanted to highlight some areas that if we focus on could lead to improvements in the future, and I think it's really important that we address inequality experienced over the life course, and I think I've highlighted why that's important in terms of some of the inequalities that I shared at the beginning. It's also really important to improve understanding of dementia where the experience of the condition might be limited. This will require workforce development to enable them to better understand diverse communities and the type of support they need. It's also really important to support Black, Asian and minority ethnic-led voluntary organisations. These organisations are often the first port of call for people and a trusted source of support. So we need to ensure that they are funded, resourced and empowered and upskilled to be able to offer the adequate support for the communities they serve. And personalised care, that is kind of the aim moving forward for health and social care services, is like business as usual personalised care. And this must be based on ongoing and meaningful engagement with everyone, all partners, but in particular minority ethnic people living with dementia and their carers who have used care and support. So I think in closing, I think it's important to say that a dementia diagnosis can often be viewed as a death sentence. So in raising awareness, we need to be clear that people can still lead fulfilling lives. But what's also clear is that the diagnosis and the support after for Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities isn't what it should be, and that needs to change. Thank you.